There was one room in Grandma's house that never felt like part of the house. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden. It sat right there at the end of the hallway, its door always closed, its presence quietly dominating the space around it. As children, we were told not to touch it. As adults, we learned not to ask about it. Grandma never raised her voice, never scolded harshly, but when it came to that room, her silence was firm enough to stop any curiosity before it could form into words. The rest of the house was warm, lived in, filled with the gentle clutter of a long life. Family photos, worn furniture, the smell of old books and cooking spices. But the hallway changed as you walked toward that door. The air felt heavier. Even the light seemed to dim, as if the house itself respected whatever boundary Grandma had drawn there. No one lingered near it. No one leaned against the wall beside it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to reverence mixed with unease. I remember once, when I was very young, asking Grandma what was inside. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me for a long moment, her eyes calm but distant, as if she were seeing something far away instead of me. Then she said, quietly, "Some doors are not meant to be opened early." That was all.
No explicación.
No warning. Just a truth she expected us to accept. And we did. Years passed. Life moved on. The room remained untouched. When relatives visited, they noticed the door, but quickly learned not to comment. When repairs were made to the house, workers were told to avoid that end of the hallway entirely. Grandma handled everything else herself. Paint peeling?
Fixed.
Roof leaking? Repaired. But that room stayed exactly the same, frozen in time, immune to maintenance, untouched by change. What made it stranger was how carefully Grandma lived around it. She dusted the hallway every day. She kept the door clean, polished, as if appearance mattered even if access did not. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear her walking slowly down the hallway. I never saw her open the door, but I knew she stood there, waiting, remembering, guarding something only she understood. As Grandma grew older, the room became a silent point of tension in the family. Not spoken of, but felt. There were whispers during holidays, quiet conversations when Grandma wasn't around. Some thought it was grief. Others assumed it held something shameful. A few joked nervously about it being empty, kept closed only, because Grandma liked control. No one knew, and somehow not knowing became normal. Then Grandma got sick. It happened gradually the way serious things often do. At first, she was just tired. Then forgetful. Then weak in ways she couldn't hide anymore. The house changed with her. The warmth remained, but something fragile entered the air. We started visiting more often, helping with meals, staying longer than usual. The hallway felt closer now, harder to ignore. The door at the end seemed to watch us, unchanged while everything else slowly fell apart. One afternoon, as I helped Grandma back to her chair, she glanced toward the hallway. Her eyes lingered on the door longer than they ever had before. I saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, not regret, but decision. Later that evening, she asked me to sit with her. Her voice was steady, but quieter than usual. "There's something you need to understand," she said. "That room, it was never about keeping you out." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It was about keeping something in." I waited for more, but that was all she said. A week later, Grandma was gone. The house filled with people again, with grief and noise and movement, but the room remained silent. At the end of the hallway, the door stood exactly as it always had, unchanged by death, untouched by mourning. For the first time, no rule protected it anymore. No voice reminded us not to open it. And yet, no one moved toward it. Not at first. Because somewhere deep down, we all knew that once that door opened, the house, and our understanding of Grandma, would never be the same again. After the funeral, the house felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people inside it. Voices echoed strangely, as if the walls were listening but no longer responding. Everyone moved carefully, almost politely, around Grandma's things, unsure what belonged to grief and what belonged to habit. And through all of it, that room waited at the end of the hallway, quiet and patient, as if it had all the time in the world now that Grandma didn't. For the first 2 days, no one mentioned the door. It was there, of course, impossible to ignore, but it existed in a strange agreement of silence. We cleaned the kitchen, sorted papers, folded clothes, all the normal rituals that follow death. Yet every time someone passed the hallway, their steps slowed, their eyes drifted, their breath changed. The room had become a question with no answer, and no one wanted to be the first to ask it out loud. It was my aunt who finally broke the silence. Late in the evening, when most people had gone home and the house had settled into a heavy quiet, she stood in the hallway staring at the door. "We should open it," she said, not looking at anyone in particular. Her voice wasn't bold. It was tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying curiosity for too long. Immediately, the air shifted. My mother stiffened. Someone else muttered that it could wait. Another said maybe it should never be opened at all. Arguments followed, low and tense, circling the same fears without naming them. What if it was something disturbing? What if it was something painful? What if Grandma never wanted us to know? But those questions collided with another truth, one no one wanted to admit. Grandma was gone, and whatever she had protected so carefully was now unprotected. Time, dust, and ignorance would eventually take their toll. Waiting wouldn't preserve the secret. It would only rot it. The first step toward the door felt heavier than it should have. I remember noticing the details I had ignored for years. The faint scratch near the handle, the slight warping of the wood, the way the doorframe didn't quite match the rest of the house. This wasn't just any door. It had been replaced at some point, installed deliberately differently. That realization alone sent a chill through me. Grandma hadn't just kept the room closed. She had reinforced it. My hand hovered over the handle. For a moment, I half expected Grandma's voice to stop me, calm and firm. But there was only silence. When I finally touched it, the metal was colder than the rest of the house, as if the room behind it existed in a different season altogether. The door resisted at first, stiff from years of disuse, then gave way with a slow, reluctant creak that echoed down the hallway like a warning. The smell hit us first. Not rot, not decay. Something older. Stale air mixed with paper, fabric, and time. The light from the hallway spilled inside, revealing a room that looked frozen mid-thought. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left. A narrow bed, a desk, shelves lined with boxes and binders. The walls were covered, not with decorations, but with photographs.
Hundreds of them.
No one spoke. We stepped inside slowly, afraid that sudden movement might break something fragile and invisible. The photographs were not random.
They were organized.
Faces appeared again and again, aging across the walls.
A boy.
Then a teenager. Then a young man. In every photo, taken from a distance slightly off-angle, like someone watching rather than participating. And always, somewhere in the frame, was a familiar presence, a shadow, a reflection, a partial figure that could only be Grandma. The realization settled slowly, then all at once. This room wasn't storage. It wasn't a shrine. It was a record. A life documented in fragments. Someone Grandma had watched, protected, followed through time without ever stepping fully into view. The question wasn't who this person was anymore.
It was why.
On the desk lay a single notebook, open to the first page. Written in Grandma's handwriting were the words, "If you're reading this, you're finally ready." And suddenly, the room didn't feel like a secret anymore. It felt like an invitation. No one touched the notebook at first. It sat there on the desk, open and waiting, as if it had been expecting us for years and was in no hurry to be read. The room itself felt strangely calm now that we were inside it, like it had completed its purpose the moment the door opened. The air was still heavy, but no longer oppressive. Instead, it carried a sense of quiet anticipation, as though Grandma had been standing there all along, watching to see how we would behave once the truth was no longer locked away. When I finally stepped closer, I noticed how deliberate everything in the room was. The bed wasn't made for sleeping. It was too narrow, the blanket tucked tight like it had never been disturbed. The desk was worn in one specific spot, where someone had leaned forward for years, writing, observing, recording. The shelves held boxes labeled with dates, not names, spanning decades. This room hadn't been used randomly or emotionally. It had been used methodically.
Purposefully.
Whatever Grandma was doing here, she had planned it carefully. I picked up the notebook, my fingers brushing over the familiar loops of her handwriting. The first few pages explained very little. Grandma wrote about watching from a distance, about learning how to be present without being visible. She described love as something that doesn't always announce itself, something that sometimes survives best in silence. The words were calm, almost instructional, as if she were teaching a lesson rather than confessing a secret. But beneath that calm was something heavier, a sense of restraint, of emotion tightly controlled over many years. As I turned the pages, details emerged. The boy in the photographs wasn't a stranger. He was connected to the house, to the family, to Grandma's past in a way that made my chest tighten. Grandma wrote about a promise she had made long before any of us were born, a promise that required her to step back from a life she could have had and choose one that kept her in the background. She never named the person she was protecting, only referring to him as the child. Then later, the young man. Names, she explained, make things harder to let go of. The photographs on the walls began to make sense. They weren't invasive. They were careful. Grandma had documented milestones she was never allowed to attend openly, graduations, first jobs, moments of struggle and recovery. She wrote about sitting in her car across the street, watching lights turn on and off in a window, just to reassure herself that he was safe. Not once did she complain. Not once did she ask for recognition. The room wasn't built from regret. It was built from resolve. The deeper I read, the more unsettling the truth became. This wasn't just about love. It was about protection from something larger. Grandma hinted at circumstances that required secrecy, choices made by others, consequences she alone was willing to carry. She wrote about shielding the rest of the family from a truth that would change how they saw her and how they saw themselves. The room, she explained, was a boundary, a place where she could hold the truth without letting it leak into the rest of the house. My mother sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her face pale. All this time, she whispered, she was living two lives. But as soon as she said it, it felt wrong. Grandma hadn't been divided.
She had been focused.
Everything she did in the open house, the cooking, the kindness, the quiet routines, now felt like the visible half of something much larger. Near the back of the notebook, the tone changed. The sentences grew shorter. The handwriting less steady. Grandma wrote about time running out, about feeling her strength fade, and about the room becoming too heavy to keep closed forever. She admitted that she had considered burning everything, erasing the evidence completely. But she didn't. She wanted the truth to survive her, even if it confused us at first. The final pages ended with an address. Not a memory. Not an explanation. An invitation. Grandma had never spoken about the room because the room was never meant to speak for itself. It was meant to lead us somewhere else. And suddenly, the biggest question wasn't what the room was hiding. It was who was waiting at the other end of the story. The address sat on the last page of the notebook like a quiet challenge.
No explanation.
No warning. Just a location written carefully, deliberately, as if Grandma knew exactly how much that single detail would weigh once we saw it. For a long time, no one spoke. The room that had felt calm moments earlier began to tighten again, filled with unasked questions and unspoken fears. We all understood, without saying it out loud, that going to that address would change things in a way opening the door never fully had. It took us 2 days to decide to go. 2 days of restless sleep, whispered conversations, and second-guessing everything we thought we knew about Grandma. The photographs on the walls haunted me. The way the boy aged over time. The consistency of Grandma's presence at a distance. This wasn't obsession. It wasn't curiosity.
It was guardianship.
And guardianship implies danger. Something or someone that required watching, protecting, intervening quietly. That realization made the drive to the address feel heavier with every mile. The house was modest, similar to Grandma's in size, but different in feeling. Where Grandma's home felt lived in and warm, this one felt careful.
Maintained. Controlled.
The lawn was trimmed too neatly. The windows were clean but covered with thin curtains. It looked like a place where nothing was left to chance. We parked across the street, suddenly unsure of ourselves. For the first time since opening the room, I felt like we were intruding, not on a space, but on a life. We didn't knock right away. We sat there, watching. And then, in a moment so small it almost escaped notice, the front door opened. A man stepped out. Not a boy anymore. Not even young. Somewhere in his 30s, maybe older. His posture was familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. The way he paused before walking down the steps. The way he scanned the street briefly before moving on. I had seen that posture before, frozen on the walls of Grandma's room, repeated across decades. The photographs weren't just documentation. They were practice. Grandma had been learning his movements the way a parent learns a child's habits. When he returned and noticed us standing there, his reaction wasn't surprise. It was caution. Calculated, restrained. He asked who we were, and I gave him the simplest answer I could manage. "We're family," I said. He studied my face for a long moment, then glanced at my mother. Something shifted in his expression, not recognition, but resignation. As if he had known this day would come, even if he hadn't known when. Inside, the house was quiet.
Clean. Sparse.
It felt temporary, like someone had lived there without fully settling into it. We sat at the table, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. I told him about Grandma's death. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look shocked. I told him about the room, about the photographs, about the notebook. That finally broke through. He closed his eyes slowly, like someone bracing for impact he'd spent years avoiding. "She promised," he said quietly. "She promised she'd never let you find me." That sentence changed everything. He told us his side in fragments at first. How Grandma had always been there but never visible. How help arrived when it was needed most, never explained, never claimed. How warnings came without names attached. How he learned over time that his safety depended on distance from her, from us, from the past she was protecting him from. Grandma hadn't just been hiding a room. She had been hiding a fault line that ran straight through the family's history. The room wasn't about secrecy. It was about containment. By the time we left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Nothing had been resolved neatly. There were no clean answers. No simple explanations that tied everything together. But one thing was clear now in a way it hadn't been before. Grandma never spoke about that room, because the room was never the secret. We were. And opening that door didn't end the story. It proved that Grandma had been holding it together for all of us, quietly, until the very last moment she could. After we left his house, the silence in the car felt heavier than anything we had experienced inside Grandma's hidden room. No one tried to summarize what had just happened, because none of us truly understood it yet. The man's words echoed in my mind. "She promised she'd never let you find me." That sentence alone suggested a level of fear and foresight that made Grandma's silence feel less like secrecy and more like strategy. Whatever she had been protecting him from hadn't disappeared with time. It had only grown quieter, more patient. Back at Grandma's house, the hallway felt different now. The door to the hidden room was still open, but the room no longer felt like the center of the mystery. It felt like a map. Every photograph, every date, every carefully preserved detail now pointed outward instead of inward. Grandma hadn't built that room to hide the past. She had built it to monitor it, to keep it from drifting back into our lives unannounced. That realization settled over us slowly, like the understanding that you've been living near something dangerous without ever knowing it. We went back into the room together, this time with purpose. We examined the boxes on the shelves, opening them carefully one by one. Inside were newspaper clippings, legal documents, handwritten notes, all connected by a single thread, incidents that never quite made sense on their own. accidents that weren't accidents, people who vanished quietly from records, court cases that ended without explanation. Grandma had tracked them all, not obsessively, but vigilantly, like someone keeping watch over a storm that might return. One box contained correspondence between Grandma and people whose names were blacked out entirely, the ink heavy and deliberate. The tone of the letters was cautious, restrained, filled with boundaries. Grandma wasn't pleading. She was negotiating, setting terms, drawing lines she expected others to respect. In one letter, she wrote that if those lines were crossed, the truth would surface in ways no one could control. Reading that, I finally understood something crucial. Grandma hadn't been powerless. She had leverage. My mother sank into the chair beside the desk, covering her mouth with her hand. She was protecting us, she whispered. Not just him. Not just herself. All of us. The room wasn't an act of fear. It was an act of containment, designed to keep consequences from spilling into the lives of people who never asked to be part of them. Grandma had carried the weight, so we wouldn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man's controlled movements, his cautious eyes, the way he lived like someone who expected the past to knock on his door at any moment. Grandma had been the barrier between that knock and our lives. Now that barrier was gone. The question was no longer what was Grandma hiding. It was what happens now that she isn't here to hide it anymore. The next morning, we noticed something none of us had paid attention to before. The door to the hidden room didn't close properly. It stuck slightly, as if it had been warped by time or pressure. Grandma had kept it shut with care, maybe even force. Without her, it resisted closure. That felt symbolic in a way I didn't like. Secrets, once opened, don't close easily again. A few days later, an unfamiliar car appeared on the street. It parked briefly, then drove away. The next day, it came back.
Different time.
Same car. My stomach tightened as I realized how carefully Grandma's vigilance had been passed on to us, whether we wanted it or not. We had inherited more than a house. We had inherited watchfulness. Standing in the hallway that evening, I looked into the room one more time. For the first time since opening the door, I felt gratitude instead of fear. Grandma hadn't left us confusion. She had left us context. The room was her way of saying, I did what I could. The rest is up to you. And as unsettling as that was, it was also a strange kind of gift. Because now, when the past moved, we would see it. When something threatened to surface, we wouldn't be caught unaware. The room had finally spoken. And it was telling us to stay alert. The unfamiliar car didn't come back the next day, or the day after that, but its brief presence had already done its damage. Once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. Every sound outside felt louder. Every shadow near the windows felt intentional. Grandma's house, which had always felt like a place of comfort, now felt like a post, something meant to observe from, not relax inside. The strange part was that no one suggested leaving. It was as if we all understood, instinctively, that walking away would mean abandoning something Grandma had spent her entire life holding together. We returned to the hidden room again, this time not as curious family members, but as caretakers of whatever truth lived there. We began to notice patterns we had missed before. Dates in the notebook aligned with the clippings. Photographs corresponded to moments mentioned vaguely in letters. Grandma had built a timeline, not just of one life, but of a threat that moved quietly alongside it. She never named it directly, but she described its behavior, the way it resurfaced unexpectedly, the way it preferred silence over confrontation, the way it relied on people assuming it was gone. One entry stood out. Grandma wrote about a confrontation that never fully happened. A meeting arranged, then canceled at the last minute. She described sitting in her car for hours, watching a building across the street, waiting for someone who never showed. Instead of relief, she wrote that she felt dread. When people disappear without explanation, she wrote, it's rarely because they've given up. That line chilled me. It suggested that whatever she had been guarding against was still unresolved, simply dormant. As the days passed, the man we had visited, the one Grandma had protected, reached out.
Carefully.
Indirectly. He didn't come to the house, but he called, his voice low, measured, as if even words needed to be chosen with caution. He asked if we had found anything else. When we told him about the letters and clippings, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said something that confirmed our growing fear. She told me this might happen, he said. That when she was gone, things would feel like they were moving again. He explained that Grandma had taught him how to live quietly, how to recognize patterns, how to disappear without vanishing. He had always believed she was being overly cautious, that whatever danger once existed had faded with time. But now, knowing the room existed, knowing how much evidence she had preserved, he realized she hadn't been guessing. She had been tracking something real, something patient. That night, I dreamed of a hallway. In the dream, the door to the hidden room wouldn't stay closed, no matter how hard I pushed. Light spilled out from underneath it, not warm or inviting, but sharp and insistent. When I woke up, my chest felt tight, like my body understood what my mind was still resisting. The room had been a seal, and seals are meant to be replaced when broken. We found the final piece by accident. Behind one of the shelves, taped directly to the wall, was an envelope thinner than the others. Inside was a single sheet of paper with instructions written in Grandma's hand. Not emotional, not reflective, practical. She outlined steps to take if certain things happened, if unfamiliar people appeared, if questions were asked, if the past attempted to reinsert itself. At the bottom, she wrote a sentence that left no room for doubt. If you are reading this, then the room did its job. Now you must do yours. That was the moment everything shifted. The room was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a responsibility to continue. Grandma hadn't spoken about it because speaking creates exposure. She had acted instead, quietly, consistently over decades. Now that silence had ended, not because the danger was gone, but because it was time for someone else to take her place. Standing in the hallway, I realized the truth was bigger than the room, bigger than the house, bigger even than Grandma herself. She hadn't been hiding a secret. She had been holding a line. And now, whether we were ready or not, that line was in our hands. Once we accepted that Grandma had been holding a line, everything we had uncovered rearranged itself in our minds. The room, the photographs, the careful documentation, it was no longer a puzzle pointing backward. It was a warning pointing forward. Grandma hadn't trusted time to erase danger. She had trusted preparation. And now that preparation had been handed to people who had never asked for it, never trained for it, but could no longer pretend it wasn't theirs, we started noticing things that might once have seemed meaningless. A phone call that disconnected too quickly. Someone asking a neighbor questions about the house under the pretense of real estate interest. A letter with no return address that said nothing more than "sorry for your loss." Typed, not written. None of it was overt. None of it was provable. But that was exactly the kind of movement Grandma had described. Quiet, plausible, easy to dismiss. The kind of movement that survives because people convince themselves it means nothing. The man Grandma had protected became more involved, though always from a distance. He never stayed long, never parked directly outside the house, never came at the same time twice. Watching him was like watching someone trained to survive without being noticed. It was unsettling to realize how much of that training had likely come from Grandma herself. She hadn't just protected him emotionally. She had prepared him tactically. That alone said more about the threat than any document ever could. One evening, while reviewing the final notebook again, we noticed something we had missed, a pattern in the dates Grandma circled more heavily than others. When we mapped them out, they aligned with moments of visible disruption in our own family history.
Moves that happened suddenly.
Jobs that ended without explanation. Relatives who drifted away without conflict. Grandma had been adjusting our lives subtly, nudging us away from proximity when things felt too close. What we once thought were coincidences were actually course corrections. That realization hurt in a way nothing else had. Grandma hadn't just been watching someone else's life. She had been shaping ours. Not out of control, but out of care. She chose inconvenience over catastrophe, distance over devastation. And she had done it alone, without thanks, without acknowledgement, knowing she would likely never be understood for it. The pressure of that knowledge began to weigh on us. Sleep became shallow. Conversations shortened. Every decision felt heavier because we couldn't be sure what was safe anymore. The house itself seemed to sense the shift.
Doors creaked more loudly.
Floorboards protested every step. The hallway light flickered once and never did again. I caught myself standing at the end of the hall late at night, staring into the open room, half expecting Grandma to be there, correcting something we were doing wrong. Then came the moment that confirmed Grandma had been right to prepare us. A man knocked on the door just after dusk. He was polite, well-dressed,
Calm.
He introduced himself with a name that didn't appear anywhere in Grandma's records, which immediately made it worse, not better. He said he was researching local history, asked if Grandma had ever mentioned certain people, certain events. His questions were casual, but precise. Too precise. When we gave vague answers, his smile never faltered. When we said we didn't know, he nodded, as if that was exactly what he expected. After he left, the house felt colder. Not physically, but emotionally, like something had passed through and taken warmth with it. We went straight to the room, to the notebook, to the instructions. Grandma had written about this scenario almost word for word. If they come politely, she had noted, it means they are checking whether silence still exists. At the bottom of the page, she had underlined one sentence twice. Do not fill silence with fear. For the first time since her death, I felt something close to clarity. Grandma hadn't built the room to trap us in anxiety. She had built it to keep us steady when anxiety arrived. The truth she left behind wasn't meant to overwhelm. It was meant to anchor. That night, we closed the door to the room, not to hide it again, but to acknowledge it. We didn't lock it. We didn't seal it. We simply chose, together, to respect what it represented. The room had done its job. It had taught us how to see. And now, just like Grandma, we would live normally, speak softly, and pay attention. Because sometimes, the most powerful defense isn't confrontation. It's awareness, carried quietly, exactly the way Grandma always had. The days that followed settled into a strange kind of calm, the sort that doesn't feel peaceful so much as carefully balanced. We went back to our routines, work, errands, conversations with friends, but everything carried a second layer now. Every sound had context. Every silence had weight. Grandma's house was no longer just a place we lived in. It was a space we actively observed. Not out of paranoia, but out of respect for the awareness she had spent decades cultivating. We never spoke openly about the room with outsiders. Not because we were hiding, but because we finally understood Grandma's discipline. Silence, when chosen intentionally, wasn't weakness. It was control, and control was what had kept everyone alive. Instead of talking, we learned to watch the way Grandma must have watched, patterns instead of incidents, behaviors instead of words. The neighborhood itself became a kind of map. We noticed which cars passed through too often, which faces lingered longer than necessary, which questions from acquaintances felt slightly rehearsed. The man who had knocked on the door never returned, but his absence was as informative as his visit. Grandma had written that once curiosity was satisfied, attention either escalated or vanished completely. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing happened, which oddly confirmed everything. Threats that disappear without noise are rarely gone. They've simply decided patience is the better strategy. The man Grandma protected eventually prepared to leave town. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately. He told us it was time, that staying close to the house, to us, increased the risk. There was no sadness in his voice, only resolve. Before he left, he stood in front of the closed room one last time and placed his palm against the door, as if acknowledging a presence on the other side. He didn't thank us. He thanked Grandma. Then he was gone, blending back into a life shaped by secrecy. That was when the house began to feel lighter. Not empty, never empty, but settled. Like it had exhaled after holding its breath for years. We found ourselves smiling at small memories of Grandma again, the ordinary ones that had been overshadowed by the revelation of her hidden life. The way she hummed while cooking. The way she pretended not to hear gossip but always knew exactly what was happening. The way she insisted on checking locks twice without ever explaining why. All of it made sense now, but it didn't make her feel distant. If anything, it made her feel closer. Eventually, we moved some of Grandma's belongings back into the room, not to erase what it had been, but to let it evolve. The notebooks stayed. The photographs stayed. But we added things too. A lamp, a chair, a small shelf of books. The room became a place of reflection rather than vigilance. Grandma had carried the burden alone. We didn't have to. Sometimes, late at night, I still stand in the hallway and listen to the quiet. Not because I'm afraid, but because I understand it. Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything that didn't happen because someone paid attention. Grandma's life wasn't defined by the secret room. It was defined by what she prevented, what she protected, and what she never needed credit for. She never spoke about that room because she didn't want a legacy of fear. She wanted a legacy of safety. And now that the door had been opened and the truth finally understood, we realized the house wasn't guarding a secret anymore. It was guarding a lesson, one we would carry forward, quietly, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted.